Conversation podcast. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and rants. Military science station podcast.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the show. Today we're talking about, I should move my mic where I can be heard. Today we're talking about why certain kinds of militaries show up in military science fiction and others might be harder to tell stories about.
Now
And
your mic's a little too close, just
now it's a
FYI.
little too close. Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
So this might be related to the conversation we had about certain kinds of jobs, but the type of military story that you're telling can have such a broader impact on what just the whole book in general. So I don't know, Jeff, do you want to start this one off? Like
Yeah, sure.
when you looked at Grimm, like obviously it's a Navy story, and I know you had specific thoughts about that, but why a Navy story versus Space Marine?
Part of it, part of it was like the initial genesis of Grimm was a long time ago, like long before I even thought I could ever be a professional writer. It was that I read the first five Honor Harrington books, and I was like, "Oh, it's so good! I love the spaceship combat. I love the feeling of the real Navy in space. Where are the other books like this?" And to my great depression, was never able to find any. There are a few here and there, but nothing that does it as well as David does it. Which is what started the whole idea of me wanting to write about Space Navy, despite the fact that I was in the Army. And there's a scope to a Navy where, like, when you're talking about ships and serving on them, the ships move around. They can go to different planets. You got Star Trek, and you've got Battlestar, and you've got all these different um, visually interesting Space Navy TV shows and movies that I think are the genesis of a lot of that. And it wasn't until, I think, it wasn't really until the last 20 years or so that the Space Marine, don't sue me, Games Workshop idea really took off and started being like the predominant amount of military sci-fi.
Well, Honor Harrington is even kind of a fast forward of like Horatio Hornblower, right? And the kind of
Yeah,
the
oh, yeah.
master
Yeah.
and commander, and yeah. So that's
Why she
definitely a
kept
lineage
losing
there.
parts of herself.
What's that?
This is why she kept losing parts of herself.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up watching Star Trek, as did a lot of people, and you know, the Kirk was always fond of quoting poems about ships, "Give me a tall ship and a star to sail her by," that kind of thing. And so
And a
I feel
green
like
slave girl.
I feel like for a lot of people my age who watch the same TV shows and the same movies and read the same books, they wanted more starships and more space travel. And you can't really do that when you're writing about the Army. You can do a little bit, but mostly the Army is on the ground and not in the wonders that is space.
Well, there's an exploration aspect to the Navy as well, or you can get into, freebooters or what's the Cavalier Navy or something that I'm trying to remember they were privateers before the British or augmenting the British Navy.
Oh,
Um,
letters of marque,
uh,
privateers.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, but I think there's also the exploration aspect that it's kind of tied into that. So you've got something really expansive and epic, and you're right, like the Army, at least the Army I was in, that you're there to seize and hold territory. Um,
Plus,
and
you have the spaceships as a character in the
yeah,
Navy. The Interceptor is a huge part of the book. She won't always be a huge part of the book. There might be other ships, just saying, no spoilers.
uh-oh.
But the having, to me, the Star Trek failed when they went away from being on ships, or at least went away from being on the
A
Enterprise.
lot of people think the DS9 is the best Star Trek.
A lot of people are wrong, and there's nothing I can do about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I liked DS9, but it wasn't. I mean, but I'm a next generation guy in original series, so original series for me
Yeah, the
is pretty
original
much
series is
where
the
it
gold
is.
standard.
I mean, even Lower Decks, which is my favorite Trek currently of the recent stuff, is about exploration and the ship, and I mean, there's whole like they do so many callbacks to you know about the Enterprise and loving the Enterprise and what that's all about that they're definitely aware of it.
I appreciate that. I don't really care for the absurd aspect of Lower Decks.
Mhm.
I prefer my Star Trek to be more serious and then occasionally have like a funny episode.
Occasional levity.
I don't know what Rick's doing, but he's got a new
I am
thing
not doing
this
anything.
week.
I paused my video for 1 second and now it is gone.
He's giving us some abstract. So everyone enjoy the abstract imagery that Rick is
Yeah,
providing.
it's like a sunset. It's like a
Yeah.
sunset.
He's
But
I
there
it
you go.
switched
You're back.
back. It switched back to my laptop camera automatically for some reason, which is closed. The lid is closed. That's why you saw that.
so Rick, yeah, I guess you can probably speak equally to Navy and Space Marine, but can you talk about why you choose to write in one or the other?
Um, honestly, I feel like for me, the whole fleet battles thing, I find it a bit too sterile. I like the boots on the ground, getting in the mud. Um, I like some fleet battles, and I've done books where I go back and forth between the ships and the ground. But having been infantry, that speaks to me more. I have more experience with it, So, and I usually use Space Marines not because I prefer the Marines to the Army, but because that's what readers expect. They expect Space Marines. I've done some books where I've made a point to make it something different, like
Top Troopers, not Marines, even though they talk about
well, they are Marines.
the
They're
descendants of the Marines. So I
they're
seem to
not the
recall
United
them
States Marine Corps, but they are the Fleet Marine Corps,
Marine Corps.
Space
Yeah.
Fleet Marine Corps. Um, and specifically they're specifically descendants of the tradition of the British Royal Marines, the United States Marine Corps, and to some extent elite army units. But mostly that's just like a few traditions or phrases they use. Um, I have written books that have, like I said, they have Army Rangers as their main ground unit, but those are mostly books that are closer to the present, and just, aren't the Rangers just happen to be the most expedient unit to put in this mission, like it's basically the present day or near future gets hold of um,
Alien
star
technology.
travel technology and have to put what we have into it.
Adapt from there.
Yeah.
What's funny is as much as I liked Stargate SG-1, the original Stargate SG-1 Atlantis, that other show could just burn in hell for all I care. Because it was not Stargate at all. It was always funny that it was the Air Force. It just yeah, I know Air Force has some really great special forces, but like it's such a small part of the Air Force to have these guys who are essentially desk jockeys running the program that has them going to different planets and fighting aliens. And I'm just
Yeah.
like, they should have had the Stargate team, and then like everybody else was Marines or Army, and
Yeah.
not like airmen running around with
And
P90s
also,
fighting infantry.
what's with the P90s,
That
They
was
look cool.
totally a
They
aesthetic
look
thing.
cool, yeah.
Yeah.
Why
One of the
the
things
ammo rejected down was the
yeah,
whole thing. Is they were constantly getting burned, but by the MP5s, the actors were getting burned in the face and stuff. And so the P90 ejecting downward was the entire reason of the show. Otherwise, they should have had, honestly, if you're fighting something like the Goa'uld and the what were the guys called?
Which ones?
Their infantry, the big guys
Oh,
with Goa'uld inside them. Jaffa.
Jaffa, yeah.
The SPAS 12 would have been the way to go
Jaffa
because
Cree.
you want to do as much soft tissue damage as possible to stop their regeneration. But there was that episode in Stargate where they were on the ship and they had the ship in space and Sam comes back and goes and tells them that they're not going to name the ship yet, and he's like, "But I want to name it Enterprise," and she's like, "No, sir, you can't name it Enterprise." So I mean, it's like when you're talking about ships, automatically you assume Navy because they're ships. They're not fighters and they're not bombers. And if you were writing about fighters and bombers, then yeah, you could go with Air Force. I recently asked Grok to analyze the market. I don't know if you can let me share a
yeah. Give me
screen.
a sec. I did want to mention the thing I liked about Stargate as well is it was like the nerds have to fight, and that
Yeah, the
I liked
scientists.
that part of it. Yeah,
Yeah, whenever they get stuck on the enemy planet, there was that one guy. He had such a great voice, but he was a heavy set dude and he had glasses, and he was like, "I don't want to go there." Yeah, it was a good show. So I recently asked Grok to look at the market for me and show me what the percentage was. Because spoiler alert, I'm working on a new series and I'm trying to come up with some ideas. And I do a lot of research when I'm working on a new series.
really? Why would you do that?
This is what Grok said, the distribution for what military sci-fi is about. I don't think there's any surprise here. The Navy with their ships flying around in space, the Marines hitting the ground. You got like Galaxy's Edge is about Legionnaires, but they're basically Marines. I think Marines is kind of the catch-all for any force that uses ships to get to planets and then takes the planets or holds the planets. And in in like a galaxy where you have to attack another planet, having an army and a Marine Corps just seems a little counterproductive. Though I think James and I have found a way to do it in Grimm's War that where it makes sense. Where the Marines are the attacking force and the army is I don't want to say rear echelon, but they come up behind and they hold the ground and they establish defenses and things like that.
Well, for me, the army,
I think it depends on how you get to the planet and
right?
how common star travel is. I mean, if star travel is harder and you don't get as many visits from starships, maybe you have an army on your planet is like the local militia to to take care of things because you don't get the Marines that often.
Yeah.
Well,
And
and
if
that's
you
you can build the army up locally. Like there's got to be a local mission of some kind. There's got to be a local purpose of putting them there. And if you want to hold on to that location, but you don't have a lot of the space resources, that's where it starts to make sense. And for me, like Rick, the army, like I also like to be on the ground. I don't like being on ships, just from a personal level. It might be a level of control. And I think I never like the idea of being on a ship and being stranded in the ocean. A submarine excites me even less, which a ship is a spaceship is kind of standing for a submarine
I have been on one submarine ever, and that was the USS Drum that was in Mobile Harbor.
uh-huh.
Because I went there and I went to the USS Alabama battleship that was there, and I went to the Drum, and the Drum is a World War II submarine, and man, it triggered my claustrophobia just getting on that thing. I can't imagine being
Yeah.
stuck on it for weeks at a time.
I was on a Ohio class submarine USS Alaska as a civilian. It came and docked in Ketchikan where I grew up. There's a sounding station nearby where they test the sonar capabilities of subs. And yeah, I mean, as a guy big as I am, 6'4", subs are not fun, which is part of why Jacob is so big, because I wanted that feeling of like constantly hitting your head and stuff. Check out, this is the top books on Amazon in military sci-fi. I think it's funny that AK DeBuff's Stranded book is on here.
He's killing
So
it.
it's obviously not military sci-fi. You can ignore it, but you can kind of see.
Starship in the Stone is probably not military sci-fi
Yeah,
either.
I know, right? You're either is Here There Be Drag. Well, I don't know about Here Be
Here There Be
Dragon.
Dragons is the second book in the Starship in the Stone.
There you go. Yeah, but
So none of
you
the
look at
top three military sci-fi books are actually military
military
sci-fi.
sci-fi. Yeah, that's just the realities of the genre we live in. But like Sons of Neptune seems like it might be the fifth artifact, maybe. I know First Command. I haven't read it. Seems like it is, but I guess we'll see. The second book, I've seen the cover for the second book. It
Star
doesn't.
Farmer at number 7.
Um,
Is that military sci-fi?
Star Farmer. Yeah. So I mean, like this is just the reality we live in. But if you see a lot of them, call sign Talon, I doubt that is either. But again, it's in the category. It's either starships, or some kind of super soldier farmer's wife.
Either starships or
For the
troopers.
love, Amazon. Popular.
Somebody's
So
reading
you
it.
can see, not because you're dealing with the very sci-fi aspect of it, there's not a lot of like way to show that this is the Air Force or this is the This is the Army. It's you have a cover. There's either a super soldier on it with cool armor and guns, or there's a spaceship. I know there's a couple of series with fighters in it, like Uplink Squadron, but at the same time, those still scream more Space Navy than Air Force. I'm not 100% sure how you would convey that you were writing a book about the Air Force or the Army.
If you're
And
writing
not
a book about the Air Force, you'd have to have like a really nice chow hall, maybe some Starbucks.
Some really nice barracks.
some pretty
The one
girls in
thing
uniforms,
a lot of people seem to forget, and maybe this is just because maybe a lot of the readers were enlisted, but we operate in a joint environment. And so the idea that it's just one service or another is not very realistic, actually. But how do you portray that? Like Jeff was
Actually,
saying, yeah. So how do you portray that? And what's the thing that really expresses very quickly that this is, an exciting story about, it takes place in space on a ship. You're going to go cool places and do cool things, meet cool people and kill them. But that's like, how do you
nice, be
communicate that?
polite, have a plan to kill everyone you meet.
I'm not going to kill the
Exactly.
cool people.
But that's kind of what we're getting at
Just
here
the
is why it's,
uncool people.
if you're going to write about something or tell a story or even find a story that's about something other than, you know, Space Navy or Space Marine, it can be hard to find it. And sometimes the cover or what's on the way the book is selling itself might not directly communicate that. And that's a mistake some authors make, is when the cover doesn't communicate what's in the book. That frustrates people.
We have
But
a whole episode on the right
on covers, yeah,
covers too, and we'll probably have more in the future. Rebecca was like, "Why didn't you have me on the show talking about covers?"
we could do
Well,
that too.
that's a really good point. Maybe I should have thought about that before we did the show.
We will
You should
enlist
do
your
it,
help.
you should do it before April. She won't have time
Yeah,
for
Right.
it.
yeah. The interesting thing is I read a book and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it, but it was written by the colonel who started the Air Force Special Forces organization. He started what they call them, the guys who jump in and they like secure the runways and they
Oh,
communicate with everybody.
Combat controllers.
Combat controllers. Yeah,
Yeah.
the guy who started the combat controllers. And part of why he started the combat controllers was the absolute cluster that he was involved in Iran trying during the hostage rescue. Because everybody wanted a piece of it. Once they had this great plan, it was going to be a very easy plan, but then every single force wanted a piece of it. Instead of the Navy doing all of it, or the Navy and the Marine Corps doing all of it, it was now the Navy was going to fly the helicopters and the Army was going to do the refueling and this and that, and it just turned into a disaster because part of it was, believe it or not, and this is the 1970s, 1980s. I don't think it's this way anymore because it wasn't this way when I was in. But the different services couldn't talk to each other. They had different radios and
yeah.
different frequencies and different the Air Force used ultra high frequency radios because they needed to be able to talk to planes, and the Navy didn't, and blah blah blah. And it's just
Longer
uh,
range, low frequency. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
Well,
that's absolutely a problem. When I was in El Paso at Port Bliss, there was a whole command, JTF 6, that was just there to coordinate joint anti-drug response. And so people have definitely learned from those lessons, but how do you make that cool? I think that's the thing that, doing your best, and this is even something that Honor Harrington kind of struggled with, is as she continued to gain rank and kind of be part of these broader commands, it was less fun to read about. Um, so that's a challenge to make that interesting, I think. But that is how militaries operate.
I think that part of the problem with not having Army and Air Force is a lot of these books, a lot of these series, and I know mine are like this, take place not incredibly far in the future. I mean, it's one of the things with military sci-fi. If you want things to sound like they are today, you have to keep them to a certain point close to where we are now, or else reset everything. And if you are organizing brand new, you just got your star drive, you just found out a reason why you should have warships, like you encountered an alien race. So you're organizing um, a military force to go into space and have ground forces on board. Well, the Navy and Marines, whatever you want to call it, Navy, Starfleet, whatever. Um, and Marines is it makes sense to have. I mean, you're not gonna start out with an army if you're just putting a few troops on a ship to defend the ship or maybe, defend an outpost on a planet. And from there, you're going to just have more Marines, more Navy. And the only way you'll wind up with anything resembling an Air Force or an Army is if you have enough enough colonies and enough population in those colonies to where each colony has its own army that's part of the larger army uh, that they recruit locally. Um, Maybe you arm them, or maybe you build weapons manufacturing plants for them. And Air Force, the only thing you're going to have that resembles an Air Force in that kind of scenario is if for some reason uh, dual environment aerospace fighters are useful. And even then, it's going to be more like naval aviators than Air Force. So it's going to be really difficult to make an Air Force make sense in any kind of a future history where you have starships and you're not like thousands of years in the future, I
I
guess.
think a great historical, like what you're talking about, Rick, there would be to look at World War II in the Pacific. There are certainly places where the Marines were just getting, chewed up, and that's not the mission we wanted them to do. Like, we want them to do the amphibious landings, but when it comes to fighting or securing an island, um, in some cases the Army was able to come in, but the Marines were just getting chewed up in that fight. But then you look at, okay, onward into the Philippines, like, the liberation of the Philippines, and where places where the Army had a bigger role, but also they're so vulnerable because you had to move them in these great, transport carriers.
Yeah.
And like any place where you're going to need a lot of people to get something done, that's where I think an army makes more sense. And even transporting an army potentially, if they've got a weapon system that you need, or communications capabilities, like all the things we're talking about, like a trained
But that's
military
only
is.
because we had armies first before the
We did.
Marine.
You're right. And if we had to build those up, I'm also thinking of a scenario where if we were projecting into space, like, are there reasons we might want to move a standing army that aren't just political, where the army's like, oh, we got to get a piece of
I think
this?
the problem is
Um,
you're going to start small in all these colonies. You're not going to,
mhm.
unless you have some kind of technology that has like I've seen elsewhere, like a gate on a planet, and you go from a gate on one planet to a gate on another planet, and there's no ships involved. All these colonies are going to start out with just a few thousand people at the most.
They're
And
more of a militia than an army.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, if your transport
Now, I
costs
mean,
are cheap, then you could
especially,
transport a lot of people.
yeah.
and if you're talking about well, Grimm's War is almost 1,000 years in the future. And if you're talking about a situation where you have colonies that are hundreds of years old, they're going to have more like armies the way they were when America was still colonies. The Fifth Virginian regulars kind of thing. The Because you're going to want to have a military capable of defending your colony, especially if you're not part of like a larger government nation that has its own navy ships that can fly around. Now, and over Grimm's War, what James and I figured out is that they had enough Marines to go with the ships and assault enemy planets, but they had no way of holding them and continuing the assault. So our idea is that the alliance was going to be revving the army back up. The army never went away; it just changed the missions. And the mission it became in the Grimm's War universe was it ran the prisons and it did the logistics, and there were some special forces involved. And now they have this mission where it's okay, we've taken this planet, we've defeated the caliphate on this planet. The Marines who were involved in that invasion need to go on to the next planet. They can't stay here. And so here comes the army with their own troops and whatnot, but moved by the Navy
Right.
to create defenses and hold the territory, which is traditionally what the Army's mission has been. Now, if you look at World War II, the entire Army and the Air Force, or Army Air Corps at the time, was involved with the war in Europe. And so it made sense to be like, okay, well, here's all these islands. Instead of flying Air Force planes out here to land on little islands and operate in conditions they're not used to operating in, let's just send in the Navy and the Marines, and they can fight this war while the Army and the Air Corps fight this war. And that made a lot of sense. because the
Well,
Army
the Army was
it
involved somewhat in the Pacific.
Yeah,
was.
but later, I mean, yeah, that's why I was kind of racking my brain to think of some examples there. I think the Philippines are a good one. Um, I have to go find some more history on that,
But
but
the
I mean,
Army's
we're there,
units historically are huge.
right?
You know, you have the guys involved in the airborne guys involved in Normandy. There were 8 battalions as part of the invasion, whereas like Marine units tend to be lighter, nimbler, smaller, more capable of mobility.
So the Army deployed 2 million men to the Pacific in World War II, um, including 3 theater armies, 3 field armies, and 6 corps, comprising 22 divisions that participated in the actions in New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa, one of the largest
And
amphibious operations ever.
Okinawa would be a good example of a okay. There was the ramp up for the potential attack, but then they
Mhm.
held it. You know, after the Japanese surrender, that's when they had to hold that. So yeah, I think we're the other thing that plays a kind of a part with the characters in the Grimm's War spinoff is a lot of them are reservists that got activated, and now they're having to train people that are part of this army that's being expanded.
It's a shame
And
Josh
so,
isn't here because the reservist was his
I mean,
big
I
short
started in
story.
the reserves. I was in a combat hospital that was all doctors, and so I was supposed to have a job, but I just ended up like cleaning weapons and setting up a field hospital over and over again. But I've always found that kind of like that's one of the things I love about World War II actually is you have a lot of people whose primary identity is actually I'm a civilian, but I'm here doing my job and I'm going to do what it takes to get this done. Um, and not necessarily I'm just a soldier. So that's something I've always found kind of interesting. So I've been playing with that a little bit with some of the characters. But I think that's the hard part. And then the other thing to think about is weapon systems. So when my what I did in the army, like, the army holds on to the ground to air capability for the most part when it comes to, now long range artillery to air defense systems. Back in the day when we actually were fielding kind of short range ballistic missiles, the army had that mission. So if logistically and personnel wise, like you've got a mission that's needed somewhere, you might have a service that they're going to do that. So okay, rather than stand that up or move that into a whole other military, it's easier to move that unit with those capabilities and take them there, and so
More efficient too, because it's like you
yeah.
wouldn't it's like if you have a majority Marines, you're not going to be like, hey, here's this entrenched ground air defense position. We need to teach you how to use all this equipment,
Mhm.
and you're never going to move from this spot ever.
Yeah.
That's not really a thing that would make
Okay.
a lot of sense to have for the Marine Corps.
Yeah. And so I think all these, we're kind of getting into it's basically world building a little bit, but what's the why behind the military? I think based just on who
Yeah,
we are, it's hard not to think about the sales aspect of it a little bit because it's
it's
one thing
true.
you put a lot of effort into something and you would like it.
Oh, you mean book sales? I was thinking like arms sales.
Oh, arms sales. Well, hey, that could be a piece too. Like, are there civilians? I mean, and that's the other thing we really haven't touched on a lot is like
I
civil.
don't know that I mean, when I first started writing, I had no idea about the tropes that would sell or these different subgenres of military science fiction. Because when I first started writing this kind of book, it was way back before all these subgenres existed. There was barely military science fiction. So I just went at it from a purely practical point of view, which was that, you know, like I said, you build up your military is just being built up, in space, and there just wouldn't be that big of a place for an army. And I still think that from a practical point of view, that makes sense. And also now that we have all this these sales data and all these tropes that have become very popular, that it makes more sense than ever to make it Space Marines because that's what people expect. And I do have like books that have local militias that work together with the Marines, but they're not really called the Army. And I feel like I'm betraying my alma mater there, but you know,
Well, what's funny is I was talking to an author on X about they were asking like, should I write about this or should I write about that, or how should I write about this one aspect of science fiction? And my question was, as well, you've asked all these questions about what you should be writing about to other authors. Have you asked yourself, what do your readers want? At the end of the day, and I've said this a million times, if you're writing for yourself, you can expect to sell one book. And that's okay. Some people want to write for themselves. They're not interested in writing for fans. They're not interested in writing for readers. That is 100% legitimate. If you're like us, where it's like we want to write books to sell books and we want readers to enjoy them, but mostly we want to sell books. And how you sell books is you get readers to enjoy them. Then you're writing for readers. And if your readers want, Space Marines dropping onto planets and powered armor, then you better dang well be writing that. Otherwise, you're going to find an audience, I'm sure. It's just not going to be a very big audience. I knew writing Grimm's War, going into Grimm's War, I knew there was an audience for Navy ships and the style of writing that I was doing. I knew who that audience was because that same audience, like David Weber and Jack Campbell and a bunch of other guys over the years who have written about Space Navy. I had a lot of military sci-fi authors tell me that it was a mistake, that I should be writing ground infantry, that I should be writing Space Marines of some kind. Again, Games Workshop, don't sue us. It's just a generic term. You lost the copyright battle. It's okay. And I was like, no, I know who my audience is. I know what they want. I know the kind of story they want. I hate the word tropes so much, just FYI. So I don't read the tropes pages and I don't look at tropes. I read books and I see what books are popular and I read those and I see what the audience wants and I give that to them, just not the way that everybody else does it. And you can do that with any genre. Just for us, since we write military sci-fi, it's really easy to see which way the wind is blowing in military sci-fi because we're familiar enough with the books because we've read, hundreds of them at this point that we know where it's going. If tomorrow my sales disappeared, I would probably end up switching over to ground-based infantry writing because that's the other biggest genre. But I don't think it's going to because there just isn't, as you saw, a
You
lot
mean
of.
ground Space Marine?
Yeah.
Well, and it's not an either or kind of thing too. Like I think there are aspects of even Grimm's War where you put people on the ground and cool
Oh
stuff
yeah,
happens.
Jennings.
And you create an opportunity for having mechanized armor and Rick plays. I mean, I guess this is something we've also talked about too. You can only do the same thing so many times, so it's kind of fun
You
broaden
think, but
it.
Well, we write it a lot, but readers don't mind reading it way
Yeah.
more than we write it.
yeah, the readers want the same. They want the same thing except a little different, basically.
And it's not like you said, James, it's not like I'm writing Space Navy and only Space Navy.
Yeah.
A large portion, I'd say 20% of every book I write involves the Alliance Marines, sometimes Raptor armor, sometimes Mudcats. Definitely a lot of Corsair action. I love the Boudreaux and flying the Corsair. Rick has whole sections of his books that are them coming in on the shuttles and the drop ships. Cam would watch the nose cam of the
the
shuttles,
yeah,
seeing
when
them
they're
get
dropping in.
destroyed, and yeah.
Well, and Cam's experience too with just development when he, first did training as an NCO and then as an officer. And we were talking about doing another show about the mentor kind of newbie relationship. And I was specifically thinking about Cam and what's the captain's name?
Skinner.
Skinner. Yeah. Because that's such a, great part of that series. And so I think there's so
Skinner
much
and
more.
Top are great. Skinner and Top are both great mentors for him.
Yeah. So there's a lot you can do in there. Like we're basically talking about the scaffolding that holds, or the spine that holds everything together, and then other pieces that you put on that are what make the story, fun and interesting to you to write.
As
Because I
a
think that's a
side
piece
note,
too. What's
as
that?
a side note, I've never really been comfortable calling my Space Navy a Navy.
Mhm.
I just find it a little bit too on the nose, I guess. So I like calling them Fleet or something like that, And it just feels like something that we would say now if we built a Space Navy now, but 200 or 300 years in the future, maybe not.
When we're not on the water anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when nobody's thinking of like of surface ships as being practical for anything.
Yeah, that's always the thing that gets me too when I'm reading sci-fi books is inevitably the main character constantly reminisces about a time period that he never was involved in. You
That's
know,
very true.
surface ships or, I remember, the simpler days of being in trenches, whatever.
Yeah.
And,
I love being in the trench with the trench foot and the scurvy and
the bad food.
I mean, it
Now,
always felt to me a little like whenever Kirk would talk about like wanting to drive a sports car, or like I think even in the newer movies they put him on a horse, and I was like, come on, really, really? I don't know.
part of that was the actors,
Yeah,
Shatner being an equestrian, he wanted to ride a horse in the movie. So, what do you do? The part of that though is sort of expected. Like readers sort of expect your main characters to be smart and knowledgeable and understand things. And I sort of took that with Jacob, and he's, historically aware, but he never refers to the same time period twice in a book. Like if he's like thinking of something that happened historically, it's never always World War II or always the Wet Navy or always the Revolutionary War. It's throughout history because he likes to read. And I
one
even
great thing
alluded to this,
about Drop Trooper was that Top actually lived through that stuff.
right? Yeah, because she was really old, right?
Yeah, she was like 200 years old.
And I allude to this in one point where I think in the last Introduction of the Courage, the XO was talking about the captain's list now on Navy ships and in some Army units. I don't know if all Army units did this, but I know a lot of Navy units do this, where they'll have a list of books that the captain or the XO has suggested that everybody reads. And I got that idea
maybe
from
for the officers.
yeah, well, for the officers, yeah. But I mean, like, no one's going to complain if the enlisted guy reads Sun Tzu. And I got this idea because I had an Army unit where the top had, he was like, you should be reading these books, and so you can see a little bit of that. I made up some books that sounded like real war books because I didn't want to just refer to a bunch of books from the 20th century. I'm like, why would people 1,000 years in the future
Or even like before the 20th century,
Yeah,
everything.
Right.
See, that's the problem I run into is that when I reference books, I try not to make it all 20th century, but then it's all 21st century and before because
yeah.
inventing something that's written, a
Well, what
hundred
I
years
did
from now
was
harder.
I thought this was pretty cool. What I did is I compiled a list of books that are studied in Naval War Academy or War College and at the Naval Academy and the Marine course, the Marine Corps course and stuff like that. And then I put them all into Grok and I was like, okay, you using these books as a reference, create titles for books that might exist 3, 4, 5, 600 years in the future
Yeah.
that sound like historical novels or historical books about war. And then I took those ideas and mixed them around or whatever. And then I used the name of my history professor from college as the author of the
That's
books.
what, stuff like Grok and Chat GPT, it's what's invaluable for is just giving you a whole word salad of stuff you can pick bits out of and make
Right.
something plausible.
And data management.
Yeah.
The data management aspect of AI cannot be underscored. It is just enough. It is just so nice to be able to like, here's all this data. Can you sort it for me? Can you show me the
Yeah.
points where it meets?
And
I
we've
spent
we've been talking about that Google Notebook
yeah.
LM thing, which is
Oh my gosh.
Very useful.
incredible. I
Yeah.
mean,
It's a game changer.
it's if I wish I had it in the last like 6 or 7 years, because there's so many times I've just forgotten what planet was this? What was the eye color of this character? And in this, you just feed it all your book. And you say, what was the eye color of this character? And it says it is blue, except you made a mistake in this book and made him green.
And the funny thing is it does get stuff wrong, but because you wrote the books, you'll know
You'll know
at
to
least
correct
for me
it.
anyways, it's like I was like, okay, that's not right. And then I'll ask it again and it'll get it right.
Well, at least Notebook
Um,
also gives you the reference, so you could click on it and read
Yeah.
that, so you can see the context as well. One thing
Yeah,
I
go,
wanted to,
I'll put that link in the
it's a great
show
tool.
notes, by the way, because that I had someone create a Bible for me and it was really pretty and they did a really great job for the Grimm's War universe, but it wasn't as thorough as being able to ask an AI, hey, search all this stuff, which is all I wanted from AI from the beginning was to be able to put my books in it and be like, tell me these events and where was this planet and what was the name of this character, and it does such a great the notebooks does such a great job of it. It's just
Mhm.
crazy.
Notebook will also create two characters, and it's relatively generic. Like you can really only, I would ask it for less time than what it offers, but like even maybe 5 minutes of two characters talking about some subject in the story. And that's kind of fun. That's kind of interesting. It
Just
has
bear in mind
bird
it's
ideas
the
for me.
same two characters. It's actually three, but it's the same two characters, same two or three characters every single time.
Yeah.
It's the same two or three voices. I went and looked at the source for they use for the voices, and it's really good. But now I'm starting to run into podcasts on
Oh,
YouTube
they're using it.
that are using, and it's the same format, right? Today
Yeah.
we're going to talk about this, and oh, it's really this really thing is really interesting, and the other person's like, oh, I really love this aspect of it. I mean, it's like almost like the same script every single time.
So
So
I,
once you hear it, you'll know it.
I was doing more like, let's talk about medials. Like so medial's a desert planet. This is what its climate looks like. Let's talk about what potential agriculture looks like and what are challenges with agriculture with you know, changes and blah blah
Oh,
blah.
I
So
didn't, I didn't even think about doing
I
that.
was doing that because I was curious about, okay, where is power going to lie on this planet, and who does the army need to figure out, who does the command need to figure out what the levers are so they don't let, the caliphate basically has like an ISIS element that will be pushing on the local populace, and where is that? So I used it to do that, and it came up with some interesting. I mean, I gave it obviously a lot of things, and because I had already kind of fed it a list of potential crops and stuff like that, but it was almost like a newscast talking about like the Alliance Army has arrived, and these are the things they're trying to do, and these are what the locals do, and so it was a good just like jogging
If you
my
still got
thought
that,
process.
I should put that over some art and put it on YouTube on the channel.
Yeah, it's in the notebook I made, so.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah. So I wanted the thing that appeals most to me about the army when it comes down to it, like I'm always drawn back to that moment in Band of Brothers when every time they arrive in a new location, the platoon sergeant, I mean, actually, it really didn't make a lot of sense because by the time he was done, he'd have so many canisters, but he takes some of the earth, he grabs soil in his
Yeah.
hand and he puts it in the canister and saves it. Because to me, that's what the army was,
That-
even as a
wasn't that
private.
from wasn't that from Saving Private
Oh, it
Ryan?
was Saving Private Ryan. I'm sorry. I thought it was also in Band of Brothers, but
It was what's his name? The guy, the sergeant,
yeah, I thought he was a platoon
Michael,
sergeant.
was it Ironsides? Was the
No.
actor's name? I can't remember.
Oh, I don't know. I just think about
He's
that.
dead now. He died, the actor, but
I mean, for me, the army is about being on the ground, digging holes in the ground, like rubbing your face into the mud. Like you really got to get to know the place where you're fighting. Whereas for me, the Navy is not as much about that.
No, it's not. I was watching Band of Brothers. I introduced it to my son. He's 18, and we were watching it together. And there's this one episode where they're digging foxholes in the side of the berm, and he looked at me. He's like, "Did you do that?" I'm like, "Oh hell yes, yes we did."
Yeah.
Tom
15 years
Sizemore
later,
was the actor.
Tom
Sorry.
digging
Sizemore, that's right.
foxholes.
I mean, try
Michael
digging a
Phelps.
foxhole in the flippin' Caliche Rock of northern
Yeah.
Fort Bliss, and you're just destroying e-tools over and over again as you're trying to do it. That's one of the things I gave
You
the
know,
soldiers a
we couldn't
meal.
dig foxholes in Hawaii.
Oh yeah,
In
because environmental stuff. Yeah,
well, I
Germany
mean,
didn't let us.
I should let me rephrase that. We could not we could not dig them in all of our training grounds, like the Kahuku Mountains weren't
Mhm.
allowed to. Um, in the other places we dug them, we had to fill them back in again afterwards and like put the vegetation back on top.
Yeah. Oh, we always had to fill them back in, but I mean, actually, what we would do is empty the water buffalo into it and then throw someone into it. That's typically what we did. But, but I don't know. I
Okay.
just I
Those who
love.
weren't in the military, the water buffalo was this giant
Yeah.
canister of water that was carried on a trailer.
We don't actually have live water buffaloes in the army.
In
No.
Canada, they're filled with alcohol, not water. Ask me.
That's actually a great point because, like in Germany, we could only dig them in. Like in Grafenwehr, if I remember right, we could dig them. But other places, we did one training exercise out in a bunch of farmland, and they actually had people following us. Every time a truck like ran off the road and caused a rut in some farmer's field, they charged us for it.
Huh.
Um, so like that's all kind of fun stuff. I mean, I guess that's the thing with the army, and I just feel like there's other kind of fun stuff you can add to the obstacles for the characters that might not be there in
For
the
the
Navy.
Marines.
The
You know,
Navy and the Air Force are very technical.
worst part was when I was in the Florida National Guard. You go to like Ocala National Forest or someplace like that and try to dig a foxhole or a fighting position.
It just fills with water.
Water.
Yeah.
He fills up with water. It sucks so bad.
We
At
did
least it
one
doesn't fill up
training
with alligators,
exercise.
right? Crocodiles.
Say
Yeah.
what?
At least it doesn't fill up with crocodiles.
We
Yeah.
don't have crocodiles except way down in South Florida,
Find their way in. We did a
but
training exercise in North Fort Bliss where one of the commanders was on his way to a staff meeting and his driver hit a cow and killed it. And this was like the first day of the training exercise. And so for the next 2 weeks, they didn't get rid of the cow. Like you just drove past it every day on the MSR, watching this thing
why
just
didn't somebody get rid of it?
they had to deal with like this farmer was going to like trying to get their money from the army, and so there was this whole deal with don't move the cow. It was also so big that if I remember right, it was going to take like a tow truck or something to lift it, and
That's
because
crazy.
I mean we had a missile transport, we could have picked it up and moved it, but then what would we do with it? So
Cut
Just
it
kind of
up.
kept running
Steak.
over it.
Cut it up for steaks.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think this is all like really good information because what you want to do is you want to have an organic, realistic reason for why these services exist
yes,
and what they do and how they operate and how they train. The Army is not the same as the Marine Corps. They're not just the same branch with different uniforms. The same thing with the Navy and the Air Force. They're different traditions, which is the biggest part of any service is going to be the traditions. It's how the service operates. You couldn't just take somebody, and I knew guys when I was in the Army who had come over from the Navy, and from the Navy before the Navy they had been in the Air Force, and they were always talking about like, well, in the Air Force we do it this way, and the Marines we do it that way, and I'm like, well, you're in the Army now, so you do it the Army way.
yep,
And
I mean, you
you know,
can, and you can, if you work on your world building enough, come up with substitutes for the Air Force, some like I had in um Holy War, you had the fighter command or whatever it was called. And then in the later on in like the drop trooper universe, there was the attack command that uses these small starships that just launched anti-ship missiles and hopped in and out of transition space, and they were more like the Air Force than the Army. I mean, sorry, the Air Force than the Navy. So you can come up with good substitutes for things like that. And if you want the Army, you
have the
can
Army.
come up with some kind of guard, the planetary guard.
I mean, theoretically, if you felt like you were doing it right enough, you could have the. I mean, the Army has boats. The Army has planes. You
right.
could just have the Army. I mean, it would take some world building and some. It would take some neat mental gymnastics to see how you made it work. I'm just not sure you need to do that
I think
unless
you
you
if
just
you want
really
if you want
were.
the Army, you need to invent a world that has gates from one planet to another where just thousands of people can walk through them.
Yeah,
Well, and you
Does that
reach a
make
certain
sense?
point, like you think about the Army, the Air Force separating from the Army, or even now that we have the Space Force, like you know it right now in our mindset or the mindset I grew up in, it's hard to think about a space force because in a lot of ways that was, those missions belong to either the Air Force in a certain sense or even the Army in other ways. But now it's its own, entity, and that's because the span of control changed, the need for funding changed, the way
the
their
mission
mission
changed.
changed, right? Their capabilities changed. And so I wouldn't be afraid of expanding and doing interesting things like that. You just got to remember that your readers might I think you got to explain it or maybe make sure the character if the characters live in it, they don't necessarily have to think about why it's that way, but you as the author can think about that and maybe put some information in there so people aren't like because
And
you'll get the
if
reader that will be like, well, that wouldn't happen that way or that wouldn't be like that or
It needs to exist for a reason,
right.
and the reason needs to be really obvious and clear to the reader.
like if you come up with a faster than light travel scenario where the ships all have to be small crews and short hops, well, that's an Air Force scenario. So
I
maybe
mean, you're
the
looking at
space
B-17s.
maybe the Space Force just kept existing, and they're called the Space Force instead of like the Space Fleet or the Space Navy. So that there's always ways to make it work. You have to decide what kind of a infrastructure you want before you build your world.
And
Right.
it all flows from technology too. Technology dictates the world building you're going to have. If you have unlimited FTL drives with unlimited mass that can pop in and out anywhere you need, you're probably only going to have one force. So everything is dictated by what the means of technology is. And I like to reverse engineer everything. So like I come up with this is what I want the story to feel like. What is the technology I need to have in order to make that happen? Because if you want the story to feel small and self-contained and like the island hopping that the Marines did in World War II, then they can't have unlimited access to personal teleportation and it can't be Star Trek level technology. It's got to be, you got to reduce it from there. If you want to have that high level of technology, then you have to come up with limitations. There's a reason why the transporter and the warp drive were always the first to break in any
Uh,
given Star Trek episode. It made things way too easy to
Mhm.
solve.
well, the
So you just
transporter was only invented because they couldn't afford the shuttle special effects.
Right.
you have to, right? And then they had to break the transporter all the time because it solved every problem. So what you have to do is come up with the technology and the limitations. And the limitations is where the story really blossoms. What the technology can't do, what it forces you to do, is where you have all the really fun, creative problem-solving stuff. If the guys in Grimm's of War, if the ships in Grimm's of War could just hit a button and go into hyperspace whenever they wanted, would be a very different story than they have to come to a complete stop, like no motion, and spend 8 minutes scanning for this very faint gravity detection or gravity presence. Then they can go to FTL. That makes it a lot different story than just, oh, hey, we're at the spot, hit the button, let's go.
Right.
So you just have to come up with technology that allows you to have the feel that you want. And if you don't know what the feel of the novel you want to have, then you aren't ready to start writing it. Really.
Yeah, I mean, and you can like you can create. I mean, this is something I did with a couple of different books. You can create limitations based on things like the size of the ship. Like if you have a big battle cruiser, maybe it can't survive jumping more than once every,
Battlestar
hour,
No,
Galactica.
few
Yeah.
yeah, I was
hours.
gonna say Galactica did that,
But
right?
you got like a small ship that can do it. So you could have Navy and Air Force type ships in the same story. You just have to think about to make it make sense to the reader. I mean, the reader doesn't need a technological explanation
No.
that sounds like they could have read it in a science book. They just need something that sounds plausible.
Right.
And they need it when they want it, not before.
Not
Yeah.
beforehand. Don't
Do
dump
not
it all.
open your book, I swear, do not open your book with a
Hmm.
10-page diatribe about how this technology got invented and why it works the way it works. Save that for the 70% mark. All right.
Yeah.
Nobody
And I
cares.
should I should say
You
when
only have to say it if it's important to the
if it's
book.
Yeah.
important. And when I talk about doing like using Notebook LLM to do this kind of stuff about agriculture and whatnot, like that's not going in the book. I'm just thinking about
Yeah.
like, okay, if I've got this high-ranking person, like
Oh
what do
no, I
they
want to see it
do?
in the book, James.
I know.
I want to
I
see
know.
a 30-page essay about the kind of agriculture that could be on that planet.
On a
Yep.
Moby Dick like essay about phrenology and whale rendering.
I know. And I would say Melville is like one of the only people that can like make that entertaining. Maybe Neil Stevenson, but he's an acquired taste.
Well,
So,
there's a time, there's a
yeah.
place where readers want the information, and maybe it's important, maybe it's not, but they are way more willing to get that information from you than in the first three-fourths of the book.
Yeah. Got to earn their
One of my
trust.
favorite examples is David Weber doesn't talk about FTL really until Honor is chasing at the end of Basilisk Station. Spoiler alert for a 35-year-old book.
It's been
Chasing an enemy
35
ship.
years. Holy crap. Damn.
Sorry. Uh, so Honor is chasing actually it might be older. 90, 91, 92 when did it come out? I can't remember. Anyways, she's chasing an enemy ship toward the hyperlimit and then explains why there's a hyperlimit and how you get to it and what it is and why it's important that they stop them.
92 is only
Maybe he went
33
on
years ago.
how long?
Not
33.
33.
Maybe he went on a little too long, but I loved it. So and I think considering how popular it is, the vast majority of the audience loved it. But he waited until we wanted it and we're ready for
Right.
it.
Mhm.
And once the audience wants something and you give it to them, that makes them happy.
Neil Stevenson is really good at making you want that explanation. He teases the mystery out through the entire book until when he delivers this long-winded and very involved explanation, you're like, yeah, I want to read this now.
Yeah. In fact, I'm thinking specifically of like Seven Eves when he's the robots that are articulated arms that they're doing in Zero G. And so you get that in the beginning of the book, but then he goes into like this whole 50-page explanation of some, I mean, actual scientist I wasn't aware of that did like these spinning chain experiments back in the 1700s that it like led to our understanding of orbital dynamics and how, spinning bodies create different types of momentum and velocity. And so
I was
it's
thinking of Snow Crash when he talks about ancient languages for a
that
couple
too.
of
Yeah.
chapters.
Yeah. And so, I mean, all that stuff. Yeah, you're right. So anyway, we're at an hour. I think this is a great discussion to talk about, and you can see how it all kind of flows back to those central foundations we're talking about. That thinking these things through, creating tension for your characters, and when it comes to a military, it's also got to hit the ground and make sense, or hit space and make sense,
Huh.
because we didn't even get into talking about like the lowest bidder on any weapon system that you're going to have, which
Yeah, that's got to be a topic for another
will
day.
probably never go away. So.
Look up
Any,
look
yeah.
up the Sergeant York tank. The Fat Electrician does a great video about it.
That was the
You want
Divad,
to
right?
know, huh?
That was called the Divad, right?
Yeah, if you want to know what happens when the lowest bidder is chosen to build a vehicle.
Oh, the Sergeant York. I thought you said Sergeant Orc. I was like, I don't remember
No,
that one.
Sergeant York.
But yeah,
The Sergeant Orc is for
that's
for
that's a
the
Russian weapon system.
Warhammer 40K. Don't sue us, Games
Warhammer
Workshop.
40K.
All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with us, and check us out on the Discord and the Facebook, and like and subscribe if you haven't already. Tell a friend about us. We will see you later.
Adios.
Arrivederci.
Auf Wiedersehen.